So over the last few weeks, we've been thinking about Pentecost and what Pentecost is all about. It's that day that Christians specifically remember that God poured out His Spirit on the disciples, the believers in Jerusalem, and they began then to worship God, and they were using languages that they had never learned. And so there were lots of people who had come to Jerusalem for the feast, and so they heard people speaking about God in their own language. And they were amazed. And about 3,000 people became Christians on that day, and the church was born. And then over the next while, all of these new believers there were joined by others as the church began to grow. And as the church began to grow, it must have been difficult to know what to do for these folks, because they were all brand new. They were baby Christians. If 3,000 people joined our church today, where do we put them, for one thing? But how do you teach them? Who leads them? How do they know what to do and how to behave? And so it must have been really difficult. And of course, there was no Bible to help them, because it hadn't been written at that point. At first, it was mainly Jewish people who became Christians. And the worship then was based in Jerusalem, based around the temple and what they knew and what they understood from the past. But that was quite limiting because it was Jewish people, and it had kind of kept them thinking it was really only for Jewish people. And then when non-Jews started to come to faith, they didn't have that same background knowledge and understanding of God. In fact, their background often involved worship of other gods and sometimes involved ritual prostitution or sacrifices of food, and some of their practices needed to stop. So Paul writes to the Christians in Corinth because they'd been doing things when they met together that were unhelpful. Corinth was a city that was full of statues to different gods, and a lot of the worship, as I say, involved sacrificing food and animals to these gods. But when the rituals were finished, they had all this food. And so they took some of it and used it for themselves. But some of the Christians then were worried about what they should do if they were offered this food that had been sacrificed to another false god. And Paul's answer to them was, well, unless somebody actually tells you that it's been, just eat it. Eat whatever you get and thank God for it. And then in chapter 12, just before we read today, he goes into this long section about the conduct of public worship, kind of what we're doing today. When Christians get together, what happens there? What should it be like? He talks about the roles of men and women, but he really gets stuck into them about the way they were doing communion. They weren't wearing coattails and proper suits, you know. They were taking their dinner. I mean, it was a proper meal. So much so that there were folk going and they were eating far too much and they were getting drunk because they were drinking far too much. And they were doing that before other people had even arrived. And they were finished when other people hadn't even started, and it was just a whole mogar. And so he instructed them to eat together and to share what they had. And then they were also wrong in their thinking about spiritual gifts. These are gifts that are given to the people of God by the Holy Spirit. He says they're given for the common good. I don't think that's limited to Christians. I think it's perfectly right that these gifts that God gives His people are to help everybody to get to know God better. However, just like communion, some people were not using these gifts very wisely, and sometimes they were using it to make themselves feel and seem more important. So Paul uses this picture of a body in chapter 11 about hand can't say to a foot, beat it because we don't need you. And an ear can't say to your eye, well, we don't really need you. We need all the bits of the body for it to function properly and to function well. He lists then some of the gifts that people might have: apostle, prophet, teacher, healer, giving guidance, speaking in tongues. And he says not everyone will have all of these, but everybody will have one of those. Everybody will have one of those. Just want to reinforce that. Everybody will have one of those. Because God gives these gifts to His people. But Paul's saying one is not better than the other. They're all gifts that are from God and to be used to build each other up. And then he goes on to say that actually the most important thing that we have as God's people is love. And he writes to Christians in Philippi, he says that he has prayed for them. And this is what he prayed in Philippians chapter 1, verse 9. This is my prayer, that your love will flourish, that you will not only love much, but well. Learn to love appropriately. You need to use your head and test your feelings so that your love is sincere and intelligent, not sentimental gush. It's fairly to the point, is Paul. Love is a strong word. Actually, it's difficult to love people that you don't really like. But that's what we're told we're supposed to do. It's the kind of love that he's talking about in Corinthians as well. And we often read those verses for weddings. But actually, it was never intended for weddings. It works for weddings, but it wasn't intended for that purpose. Because it comes between the bit about the body and gifts and what we read today in chapter 14. If you don't know the rest of that story, today's verses are a bit odd. They really are. Do you know what? Talking in languages, what is all this stuff about? It doesn't make much sense unless you can have a wee bit of background. Certainly, it doesn't make much sense to us because that's not really our background and our heritage. Well, we'll come back to that. In that context, people were bringing words from God. They were worshipping together. They were sitting, perhaps as you and I are today. They were praying, they were reading, they were contemplating, they were thinking about God, and God gave them words to say, to share in the congregation. And there were others speaking in these different languages. Verse 5 of chapter 14, Paul says, I would like every one of you to speak in tongues or other languages, but I would rather have you prophesy. Verse 26, when you come together, each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church is built up. It's not just for your own benefit, it's so that you build the church. Verse 31, for you can all prophesy in turn. There's a wee challenge, eh? You can all. It doesn't say some of you. It doesn't say if you're particularly holy. It doesn't say if you're really spiritual, or if you're really good, or if you've given your offering. That all of you, if you are believers, can prophesy in turn. So that, not to make you look good, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. I don't think we've ever had a time in church here like Paul describes. For those who like things done in a much more traditional way in church, then I'm really happy to go back to that. I have no problem going back as far as Paul and the church at Corinth and doing that, where people eagerly desire the gifts of God, not for themselves, but to build each other up. Yet again, though, the Corinthians were getting it wrong. They were talking away in tongues, but they weren't helping anybody because nobody understood. Paul says that all of our actions in worship should be a reflection of the love that we have for God and for each other. That's why he talks about love. And that got me thinking. Paul wrote to the church in Corinth and explained where they were going wrong. I wonder what Paul would write to us. They thought they were okay. They would have pointed out to what they thought were the good things that they were doing. But Paul brings them up about their attitude and about the relationship, where they were with God, and how that was lived out with each other. See, I don't think it's so much about what we do, but how authentic what we do is. Does it really make a difference in our lives? We need to try and make our space welcoming. Of course we do. People need to feel comfortable when they come in. If the church is too hot or too cold, it's not really pleasant. We need to try and make as clear as possible the simple things like when to stand and when to sit and all that kind of stuff, where the toilets are. We need to use music that's understandable, and the language of our prayers and sermons should be easy to understand. These are all right and good and proper things to do. They are important, but much more important than that is the effect all of it has on us, God's people. Are we changing? Are we becoming more like Jesus? Is there passion in what we do? Does what we do here today affect our lives during the week? Because actually what these folks in the New Testament discovered, and what Paul says later on in this chapter, is when they met together, it was to build themselves up, to go out into the week, to be God's people, and to bring other people to faith. Do we really mean it? Do we really believe it? Is it authentic? Amen. One of the things that we must do above everything else in the church is remember God's promises. You heard them say in the video, when God says, don't be afraid, he also says, because I am with you. That's his promise. When God says and talks about the church, he said, I will build not your church, not the Church of Scotland, not the Baptist church. He says, I will build my church. We have to remember the promises of God, and we have to trust them and stand on them.